Shall we get started? Okay, there's still some room over here in the middle, down toward the front, if you'd like to move in a little bit closer. We'll ask for a larger room next year to fit everyone in, but if you're interested in international trade, you've come to the right place. So my name's Keith Schneller. I work for the Almond Board. I've been working with Julie Adams from ABC's Global Technical and Regulatory Affairs section for the past 3.5 years. And before that, I spent over 20 years working with USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service and at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, helping our farmers via export market development type initiatives. I grew up on a farm in the Midwest in Colorado, which you might not consider to be the Midwest, but I was taught to believe in free and fair trade, that U.S. agriculture could compete with anyone, and that we would always be reliable suppliers to our loyal customers overseas. It seems this attitude has changed a lot in the past 10 years or so. It seems now trade, free trade, and globalization are bad words, and our politicians are exploring new ways to deal with imports and unfair competition from overseas. So I'm happy to be the moderator for today's panel on the new administration, new trade agenda. First, I would like to introduce you to one of our panelists, Jonathan Hoff, who is the chairperson of the Almond Board's Technical and Regulatory Affairs Committee, a third-generation almond farmer, CEO of Monte Vista Farming, and an experienced almond exporter. So, no comment on the almonds or almonds.
It's almond, Keith.
It's almond, okay. So before we get into a discussion about what's happening today with today's trade policy, I'd like to introduce you to my former boss, Sharon Bomer-Larritzen, who is a true expert in international agricultural trade. She headed up the Agricultural Affairs section at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office for a number of years. And while at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, Sharon worked tirelessly to help negotiate deals that would benefit American agricultural exporters. She was directly involved in the agricultural chapters of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the USMCA, as well as the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement. In 2020, Sharon retired from the U.S. government and started a boutique consulting business where she continues to advise food and ag companies and trade associations on international rules related to agricultural trade, mainly related to the World Trade Organization's SPS agreements and TBT agreements. So we'll talk about the importance of those agreements after she wraps up her presentation. So Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Keith, and it's great to be here. I think it's been close to 30 years since I've been in Sacramento. I'm sorry, but always was looking forward to being able to come back to this beautiful part of our country. So Keith asked me to talk about the new administration and a new trade agenda, and I wanted to title this Get Ready to Set Sail. And please, I apologize up front. My oldest son is a U.S. naval officer in the Pacific, so I have a lot of stories. And I do think there is an analogy here on what we have gone through and will go through on trade and his experiences being a naval officer on a U.S. destroyer. So first, I'll do an outline. The outline is I want to talk a little bit about the current state of play. I always like to do a little bit about what the trade numbers look like because they inform and can provide a visual to see what's happening in U.S. agricultural trade. I'll then talk about past trade policy. No, I'm not going to go back to the 1880s or the 1930s. I'm going to start around 1990, something a little more current. We'll look at the last 4 years, and then we'll look at the next 4 years as to what I see happening, and then talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities for you in U.S. agriculture going forward. So we'll first look at broad Okay. Look at over big trends on U.S. agricultural imports and exports. And we'll start first on the graph on the left-hand side. The two lines in the middle, the orange line and the light blue line, are based on value of U.S. agricultural exports and imports. The orange line is exports. The light blue line is imports. And I want to start there just because so much news media on ag trade over the past couple of years has really focused on the trade deficit that we have over the past 2 years on U.S. agriculture, where we are importing more in terms of value versus our exports. And this is unique for U.S. ag. We are a global powerhouse when it comes to our exports, but over the past couple of years, imports are taking over, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The other two lines, the dark blue line on the bottom and the top brown line on top, are exports and imports in terms of quantity, which I know farmers tend to think mainly in terms of. The bottom line, the dark blue line, is the quantity of our imports, and the top round line is the quantity of our exports. So in terms of quantity, we export far more than we import. And that's because we export primarily commodities, soybeans, corn, wheat, rice, cotton, et cetera. And we import high-value consumer products primarily. What's also interesting in looking at this graph is the import quantity, the dark blue line, has a very slow, gradual increase going back to 2000, compared to the light blue line, which is the value of those imports. And you can see that so it's a steeper slope than the quantity. And in the past, 4 or 5 years, that slope has gone up like this. And that's important to understand because we are importing a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables, distilled spirits, wine, beer, and that's really where baked goods, finished processed goods from Italy or whatever. And that's really, those high-value products are what really is impacting that trade deficit. On the right-hand side is what I call the year-to-date. So these are numbers of our agricultural exports comparing January to September of this year with January and September of last year in 2023. The October numbers just came out, and I can say that the trend is the same as reflected in September, where the value change is basically the same as last year, but the quantity of what we are exporting is up about 16% this year compared to last year. A different look is how are our agricultural exports doing under our free trade agreements. The U.S. has 21 countries that we have trade agreements with. 20 of those countries I would call free trade agreements. One country, Japan, we negotiated that in 2020, and that is I'll call a partial trade agreement. It doesn't cover all agricultural tariffs, but it does cover a substantial portion. And even here, you can see that as we implemented more trade agreements with trading partners, that slope on our exports got a little bit steeper. In 1994 is when we entered into the North American Free Trade Agreement and the World Trade Organization. In 2001 is when China joined the World Trade Organization and lowered their tariffs and opened their markets, and U.S. exporters took advantage of that. We saw a CAFTA in the Central America region in 2006, and then our last set of trade agreements in 2012 that we entered into with South Korea, Panama, and Colombia. I want to say that these trade agreements are important, and the example I'll give is with almonds. And if you were in the last session, you heard a lot of conversation about Morocco. We have a free trade agreement with Morocco. It entered into force January 1 of 2006, At that time, we had less than $2 million worth of almonds going to Morocco, and we had a 50% tariff that we were paying on those shipments. Last year, we exported $116 million worth of almonds, with that tariff having been eliminated in 2021. South Korea is another example. We entered into that in 2012. Tariffs have been eliminated, and our exports of almonds are up 9%. So free trade agreements are good for U.S. almonds. Specifically on almonds, I just wanted to put together a picture of the past 10 years of our trade. Again, the top line is the value of our almond exports globally, and you can see there's some up and down, but it's basically stable. But if you look at the bottom blue line, that's our quantity. And again, we are seeing that increase over time again. Year to date exports are on the right-hand side in the bar chart. October numbers, again, are very similar in trend to the September numbers that this chart shows. Metric tons were about the same level as last year. But interestingly, our value of the almonds is up 7%. So you guys are doing something on your pricing and your value, which is a good thing. Top U.S. export markets for U.S. ag. These are our top 15 export markets, but I think the circled countries are those that are important markets for U.S. almond exports. But what I like to look at here is, you look at on the left-hand side, those three groups of countries, China, Canada, and Mexico. We'll come back to that later in this presentation. And then the second group is EU, Japan, and South Korea. All those other countries are really small for U.S. agricultural exports, and yet we do export to 163 countries around the world. So let's talk about some of the challenges that have been facing all of you and our exporters over the past handful of years. None of this is going to be new to you, but I think it helps, again, put things in perspective. The strength of the US dollar is strong. That makes our exports more expensive overseas. It makes imports cheaper here at home. We have had wars that have disrupted agricultural trade in Gaza, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. Transportation availability and costs, huge problem a few years ago, and we still have blips with a pending East Coast port strike again looming for us in January. The Red Sea had attacks, making it difficult to ship through the Suez Canal. Energy costs, fertilizer costs, I'm sure all of you are still dealing with those high costs and input prices. Labor shortages, particularly in specialty crops. I work with the fresh fruit and vegetable industry. It's their #1 issue. They can't get affordable labor. Weather disruptions across the country. We also have weak economies in both Japan and China that we're having to deal with. And of course, a great deal of uncertainty, both in terms of trade and foreign policy between the US and China. But there's other types of problems that we have in US agriculture. We have a whole range of trade barriers to our exports, and I like to put them into 4 buckets. And the first bucket is tariffs. Almond industry in particular is a little bit of a poster child here of the difficulty of competing in our export markets with third countries that don't have to pay those tariffs. And the poster child there is Australia, that is very busy doing trade agreements around the world. We also have issues on tariffs with the retaliatory tariffs. During the first Trump administration, US agriculture got hit hard when the US imposed tariffs on China I can talk about various reasons, but also put tariffs on European Union and still Turkey, India, related to their exports of steel and aluminum. I'll say in the case of Turkey, those tariffs are still in place. In the case of China, the tariffs related to the steel and aluminum retaliation, that's called 232, those tariffs are still in place on almonds. On the other measures that the US government took against China, called Section 301, related to intellectual property violations and technology transfer concerns, There is currently a process that China has in place that the almond industry takes advantage of so that those additional waivers, tariffs are waived. In the case of India, the US government just negotiated last year an agreement with India to resolve a number of trade disputes, and as a result of that agreement, India's retaliatory tariffs on almonds were eliminated earlier this fall. The second bucket is what we call sanitary and phytosanitary measures. This is food safety, things related to plant health and diseases, insects, as well as animal health issues. A big issue facing US agriculture is how governments are establishing, or in many cases not establishing, or even withdrawing allowable levels for pesticide residues. The European Union is the poster child as they try and reduce pesticide use, not only within the 27 countries of the European Union, but now they're trying to foist that on countries around the world, and the first set of products that they're targeting are neonicotinoids. China, India, other countries as well, we have a lot of problems on making sure that decisions are made to provide for maximum residue levels for imports that are science-based and risk-based. The third bucket is what we call technical barriers to trade. So basically, these are regulations that are not related to food safety, animal health, or plant health. Examples facing the almond industry in China, and Keith had many a sleepless night dealing with this. They implemented a program where you have to register your export facilities with the Chinese government in order to be able to export. It was very difficult. Lack of information, confusion, didn't make a lot of sense a lot of times. There's still problems now on getting new export facilities to have them registered. In India, problems related to packaging labeling, certification issues, even transparency to know what are the regulations. Those would all be considered technical barriers to trade. And then the fourth bucket, which is generally applies to other products other than almonds, is what we call domestic farm support. So in the US, that's the Title I in the Farm Bill, where farmers of the commodities, cotton, corn, wheat, soybeans, et cetera, they get payments from the United States government. But it can take different avenues as well. For example, in the case of Algeria, they put in seasonal import bans on almonds so as to protect their farmers. In the case of India, India uses a very trade distorting type of farm support based on market prices, as well as export restrictions, and that's really done a number in the rice and wheat international markets. But there are other headwinds as well facing our future trade policy. And here, this is a fun little chart that always fascinates people. This looks at global trade for all these different countries. It's total imports, total exports, and which countries are trading with which. It's not just agriculture, it's all goods. And this one represents 1990. And as you can see on the left-hand side, a lot of those flags are European flags, so they were one hub for global trade. And on the right-hand side, you can see the American flag. We were the hub, the other hub. China is on the bottom with a very small circle. Fast forward 30 years, that's a very different map. Yes, you still have Europe there, primarily Germany sort of being the center of attention. On the right-hand side, it's not the United States, it's China. And that is a result of China joining the World Trade Organization. So it's a very different world that we live in today. So the other headwind we have, and I referenced this a little bit earlier, is every country has tariffs, but if you enter into a free trade agreement, that agreement usually is intended to lower the tariffs to help facilitate trade, and the United States has fallen behind. Our last agreement that we entered into, a full trade agreement, was in 2012. We currently have free trade agreements with 20 countries. But look at the countries. These are our competitors. These are our markets. Canada has free trade agreements with 51 countries. China, 39. Mexico, 50. Australia, big competitor to California almonds, 30 countries and growing. Brazil is part of what's called Mercosur. It's a customs union of 5 South American countries. They just announced on December 6th an agreement with the European Union to eliminate most tariffs, but not necessarily all, et cetera. Now, I do want to caveat, I ask you not to use these numbers in the press. This was based on me sort of going through lists of trade agreements based on what I knew and saying, yeah, I think that one deals with tariffs. No, I think that one only deals with investment. So these are rough numbers, and it's also important to remember that not all trade agreements eliminate all tariffs. China in particular tends to not enter into trade agreements that eliminate all tariffs. Okay, now let's shift and start looking at trade policy. So trade policy is what governments decide to do on regulations or programs or whatever that can influence trade. And I'm not going to go back to the 1880s. I'm not even going to go back to the 1930s. I'm just going to start in the late 80s and 1990s. Late 80s, 1986 is when we entered into our first trade agreement with Israel. Oh yeah, agriculture was left out. There's now special arrangements that we have with Israel, but it's certainly not free trade with Israel in agriculture. And then in 1988, we entered into a trade agreement with Canada, which was really sort of the first big comprehensive free trade agreement. And then in the early 90s, we were negotiating for, 7, 8 years. In 1994, we announced what's called the Uruguay Round Set of Agreements, which was the set of agreements that we now know is through the World Trade Organization. And that's what people think of, WTO, World Trade Organization. And that set of agreements was the first time that agriculture tariffs were lowered across the world and then capped in order to try and promote trade. We also established for the first time rules on how to pursue science-based regulations on food safety, aflatoxin, for example, or pesticides, plant health diseases, animal health, and various rules for non-tariff barriers. There's a whole set of agreements. It also, for the first time, established a dispute resolution system. So if 2 countries disagree on a measure, and I say, I'm country A, and your measure is stopping my exports unfairly, there was a process to go through at the WTO in Geneva, very judicial, very legal, to argue why that country should change that process. The North American Free Trade Agreement was also agreed to and implemented in 1995, incorporating the Canada Agreement and including tariff elimination with Mexico. Fast forward to the 2000s, that's when we had a whole rush of free trade agreements that we were doing, and some of them in large part was due to 9/11 and interest in building allies around the world to deal with terrorist organizations in the Middle East. That was clearly why we did an agreement with Australia. And we entered into 17 agreements with 17 countries in the early 2000s. And at the same time, that is also when China joined the World Trade Organization, and the United States Congress voted to give what we call it's permanent normal trade relations. And that means that China gets the same tariffs applied to their products as every other country in the World Trade Organization. So then we shift in 2017 to a new paradigm in our trade policy. And the focus was very much focused on supporting our domestic industrial base. I call it heavy manufacturing. And that's when we retaliated against countries on steel and aluminum. It's when we retaliated against China on a range of issues. There was also a new focus on trade deficits and a view that if we had a trade deficit with a country, That was because something wasn't fair. Now, we are a large country. We have, 370 million people. We have a strong economy. The administration was looking at the trade deficit even for poor countries or countries with populations 1/10 of ours. So a lot of economists questioned whether an approach on trade deficits was appropriate. In response to a lot of the actions that were taken, and you're going to remember this, I'm sure, the administration laid out $28 billion to farm subsidies to American farmers because those countries didn't like the fact that tariffs were being applied to them, China, Europe, Turkey, India, et cetera, and they retaliated against American agriculture because that was the power base for the administration at that time. That administration also disrupted the dispute settlement system at the World Trade Organization that I mentioned earlier. So we no longer have a functioning dispute settlement system that can fairly adjudicate disagreements between countries. I will say on the positive side, the last administration did start free trade agreement negotiations with 2 countries, the United Kingdom and Kenya, but they didn't have time to finish them before we had another change in administrations. So shifting now to our current trade policy, so the current Biden administration, and I'm trying to be balanced on both sides here, they did move forward and try and rebuild foreign and trade relationships with allies, but I'll argue that our allies are still nervous and tentative about what the U.S., the stability of the U.S. trade policy. They focused on what they called a worker-centric trade policy, and those of us who do trade policy in Washington, it took us a long time to figure out what that meant. It essentially meant we are going to support the right of people around the world to have collective bargaining, and we're going to support trade unions who historically in the United States are not big fans of open trade. The Biden administration also kept in place a lot of the tariffs that had been imposed on China. They even expanded the list of products that were affected by those tariffs, for example, on EV cars. And they did also, though, work to find negotiated solutions in other countries. So they negotiated a solution with the European Union to lift the retaliatory tariffs that the EU had. As I mentioned, they did the same with India, and they did it with Japan and South Korea. And for some reason, I don't know why, they did not do it with Turkey. This administration also engaged at the WTO. It took them a while to engage, but they have been trying to negotiate with some limited energy on creating a functioning dispute settlement system. They also had managed trade outlook when they tried to solve disputes. They continue to be very cautious about their trade policy and their foreign policy with China. And they also are releasing a couple $2 billion on export promotion programs that the Almond Board, I know, is taking advantage of. What they did not do is they did not pursue any free trade agreements. And in fact, the UK has dropped off the map. Kenya, they changed the whole scope of the negotiations with Kenya by eliminating any conversation about lowering tariffs. They started discussions with several countries in the Indo-Pacific region, but those discussions do not include any tariff negotiations either. The one thing I put at the bottom of this slide is to be aware, I've been doing government policy now in trade for 40 years. Every single administration works on the nuts and bolts regulatory barriers that face agricultural exports. Every year, it doesn't matter which administration. So when you've got a regulatory issue where you have problems getting into country X, the great staff of the Foreign Ag Service that Keith was a part of, the Ag Office at USTR, they're there to help and work on those issues to the best of their ability. So Now what? We have a new administration coming in January 20th. I've got a number of quotes that I've collected over the past few months from the incoming president. I fully believe in tariffs economically when you're being taken advantage of by other countries. Tariffs are the greatest things that have ever been invented. Everything that Mexico sells into the US is going to have like a 25% tariff until they stop drugs from coming in. We're going to bring the companies back. We're going to lower taxes for companies that are going to make their products in the USA, and we're going to protect those companies with strong tariffs. Beyond the economics, tariffs give you the power to dealing with other countries. And I think these quotes are very telling for what to expect going forward. So what are our challenges going to be? Well, China, the president has called for 10% tariffs on day one of the new administration. And earlier he called for 50 to 60% additional tariffs on imports from China. He's called for strategic decoupling between us economically. And not just the incoming president, but many members of Congress have called for repealing what I discussed earlier, permanent normal trade relations status, which means, in other words, that the tariffs for Chinese products coming into the US can go higher. Based on my experience back in 2017, 18, and 19, China will retaliate. They're already getting ready. We've seen a lot of reports coming out of China where they're providing even more subsidies. Today's news is they might actually start focusing on building some of their domestic consumption, which would be nice. But I do expect, and any trade lawyer will tell you, that the administration does have the authority to put an additional 10% tariffs on Chinese imports coming in on day one. And they probably have the legal authority to also impose the 50 to 60% tariffs on all products. US agriculture will be hurt. China will remove the waiver that they currently offer to US agricultural products coming into China, and they can easily expand and create other problems for any products going into China. In the case of Mexico and Canada, the incoming president has called for 25% tariffs until Mexico and Canada constrain immigration coming into the US, as well as illegal drugs. Obviously, both are important policy objectives. And I'll say, I can confirm, because I've talked to folks at the Mexican and Canadian governments, they are already talking to key people in the incoming administration to try and resolve the concerns and implement new steps in order to try and avoid that 25% tariff. The other thing to keep your eye on is, though, under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, it's up for review on July 1 of 2026. And that review was a new mechanism put in when we renegotiated the agreement in 2018 and 19, where if a party decides they don't want to continue that agreement, they say so on that day, and then you spend the next 1 to 10 years trying to resolve whatever the problems are or to renegotiate a new agreement. I fully expect that the incoming Trump administration will not agree to continue that agreement, and it will start that sort of annual process of trying to resolve concerns. The next thing, the incoming president has talked about applying 10 to 20% tariffs on all countries for products coming into the US, using the terms like what's fair, or seeking reciprocal tariffs, seeking balanced trade, even referencing socially necessary policies as part of that fairness. The statutes, talking to trade lawyers, it's a little bit more iffy. There are trade lawyers that believe that the president has the authority to do it under a national security umbrella, but all the trade lawyers I've talked to in DC expect that any action similar to this across all countries will be challenged in court, and in fact, lawyers in Washington, D.C. are already being signed up to fight those tariffs. So the outcome will be unknown. The president could decide to do this more product by product or country by country, again, in that issue of fairness. Bottom line, though, is I think this is a mechanism to create leverage into resolving our differences on whatever they might be, whether that's regulatory barriers or balance of trade or whatever the issues might be. I see this more as an ability to get those countries in good faith to the negotiating table to try and resolve these differences. The fourth challenge is that we will continue to have a non-functioning dispute system, resolution system at the World Trade Organization, which means that if we've got disagreements with another country, we're going to have to solve it using the leverage that tariffs provide rather than trying to get agreement in Geneva. And with challenges, there are opportunities, right? As I noted, the threat of tariffs can create leverage to negotiate solutions. Agriculture can be on the table, whether there are tariffs or non-tariff barriers. And I like to tell a story here. This, January 21, 2017, that's the first Monday after inauguration for President Trump. My office at USTR at the time was on the 4th floor, near the top. To get there, you had to take a really slow elevator or a lot of stairs. And at 4 o'clock, I'm working at my desk, and in comes this gentleman, and he sits on my couch. And he says, Sharon, I'm Stephen Vaughn. What are we going to do to help our farmers when we implement our trade policy? Well, I was a little taken aback, because nobody from the 2nd floor ever came up to the 4th floor. We always had to go down. But, day one, they knew exactly what was going to happen in terms of retaliation to U.S. agriculture. And to their credit, I knew from that day forward that anything that we or USDA could come up with in the trade area to help resolve barriers, it was time to put that list together. And the administration was always open to anything that we wanted to do to help our exports in those markets. Other opportunities I would include our free trade agreement negotiations. I don't think this is going to be an administration that does that right off the bat. But I do think, in light that they had that interest 4-6 years ago, I do think we have that opportunity. I'm not yet convinced it'll be the United Kingdom because they have a new government and they have a lot of opposition from their farmers to not enter into any more free trade agreements. Kenya might be on the table, although I'm not convinced that Kenya is going to be a huge new market for U.S. agriculture. Certainly could solve a lot of problems. Bottom line, agriculture will be on the table front and center in any free trade agreement negotiations we do. The other area is whether there's an interest in fixing the World Trade Organization so that it functions again. And I'm going to gloss over this. I have this in slides that I've used in previous conversations recently, but it's quite clear that the former USTR, Robert Lighthizer, may not have a role in this new administration. He was passed over for the positions that he was looking for. That obviously may change, but Robert Lighthizer also is a mentor for the individual who has been named as USTR, Jameson Greer, who's a great guy. So there may be an opportunity, again, it won't be near term, to see if we can fix things at the World Trade Organization. Again, agriculture can be at the table. So going back to my Navy theme, yes, there are going to be rough waters ahead. And now's the time to chart your course to weather that storm. So what is your course? Here are some ideas, things that the Almond Board of California can do. First of all, you have to have your list of your priority issues needing to be resolved in your export markets day one. You need to get them on the desks at USTR, at USDA, at State Department, at Commerce, throughout the government. You need to know what free trade agreements really would benefit almond exporters. Is it Kenya? Probably not. Is it markets in Southeast Asia? Have that list together. Make it as long as you want, because you never know when that country is going to be willing to come to the table, and you want to be ready. You want to make sure your government civil servants and your politicals know your list. The second, knowing your list, education of the new administration officials, but also importantly, career staff, people like Keith and I. We're the ones that are writing the briefing papers. We're the ones making the recommendations on what to do for the politicals. So it's very important to be in there to educate the career staff as well as the politicals on the problems you're having, the value of the market, what can be done that would make it easier to export. You can also work directly with foreign government officials to fix a problem. Sometimes you put an issue on the table with USTR and it becomes excessively political and very difficult to solve, and it gets tied, an almond issue gets tied up with things related to Visa credit cards. It's a mess. So you have to think strategically about what kind of issues you actually want to have USTR or the Foreign Ag Service work in. Sometimes it's better just to go to the European Union Health Agency and say, hey, this is what we're doing. Can you lower our inspection rate? Next, any information you do provide must be fact-based. Forget the hyperbole. It doesn't work. It needs to be specific, fact-based, and you have to identify the value of the problem. USTR thinks in terms of money. Sorry, I know all of you do too, right? They want to know the value of the problem. If we fix it, what's it going to mean for you? You also have to, for technical issues in particular, you have to identify what are the fixes that will work. And I'll say it was incredibly important every time Julie Adams came into my office to talk about a specific issue, that needed to be fixed. By the time I needed to fix an issue, China, for example, she was the person I called saying, this is what we have. Is it going to work for you? So that kind of feedback back and forth, but having the technical expertise to help those of us stuck inside the Beltway is incredibly important. And then finally, you need to be consistent as an industry. It does not help those of us inside the Beltway if one day you've got one company coming in saying one thing, and then another day you got another company coming in saying something else, and they're not matching up, because what do? It's really, really helpful if the almond industry speaks with one voice, whether it's through your trade associations or through your leadership, whatever it is. Finally, if you really care about trade policy, 2 new books out. I recommend, I'm going to start with the second one. I put this in alphabetical order, but Robert Lighthizer wrote a book in 2023. It really is a very easy read. Start with the last chapter first, maybe. But a very easy read, and it really provides insights into the thinking and what is behind the trade policy of President Trump and the incoming administration. The second reading is by a friend of mine. His name is Michael Beeman. He was my colleague at USTR in charge of Japan and Korea. He retired from the government 3 years ago and is out at Stanford now as a visiting fellow. He just published a book in early September, which really looks at how trade policy has changed over the past 20, 30 years. Heavy focus on, both the Trump administration's approach as well as the Biden administration's approach. It's objective. Yes, he does lean pro-trade, but it's still an objective analysis as to why trade policy has changed over the years. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. I told you she is an expert on these issues, and she was sorely missed when she stepped down from her position at USTR in the Ag Affairs section. So all of our commodity groups, when they would go to Washington, they would make sure to stop and see Sharon and talk about their issues. So I'm trying to be optimistic about the future and not give up hope. And it's going to be a challenging time. And I think your recommendations that you shared with us are great. And since I like to do things kind of in reverse, could you guys go back to the first slide? And I'd like to just show you some of the things that Sharon was talking about, the things that we need to do to get our lists together and be prepared in Washington, D.C. That's really a lot of the work that we do at the Almond Board in our GTRA group, the Global Trade and Regulatory Affairs side of the Almond Board. So we work on market access issues. This is our panel, our group, but I was in Karachi last year before the Gulf Food Show and went to the old Al Jadaya market and met with some traders there. But just wanted to share a little bit about the volume of trade and how trade has expanded in such a great way in the past 20 years. But it seems that we are getting caught up in some of these geopolitical issues, and tariffs are becoming a new challenge that really didn't exist so much before this past 10-year period. And then with the negotiations and with the WTO back in the 90s when the WTO was put together, I think of all the countries, India really was the one country that didn't really lower their tariffs like the rest of the WTO members did. We'll go on to the next slide. And then this is where we talk about some of the issues that we deal with. We have a monthly global update report that we put out, and for our handlers, they get a regulatory, the RIM. There's a message that goes out every Friday to the handlers about different technical issues that are happening. We're monitoring what's going on in these other markets overseas with the USDA FAS offices at the posts overseas at the embassies. We also deal with a lot of you and the handlers and exporters, and when there's a problem at a port, we will find out about that information and try to come up with solutions. And then, USTR has always been an ally where when we know what the issues are and we're kind of stuck on something, we'll go to USTR, make sure they are aware of these issues, and the next time they have a chance to do their negotiations or have a bilateral meeting with that country, those issues are raised and many times can be solved. So now we can go into the panel discussion. So I wanted to again thank Sharon for her history lesson and giving us her predictions on where we're going. And we talked a little bit, and she mentioned this already, but one of the biggest complaints that I hear from our almond handlers and exporters is that Australia, China, EU, and other countries keep negotiating new trade agreements, and our guys feel like they've been left behind. So Sharon, can you talk a little bit about your experience working at USTR for these several different administrations, and then why do you think that U.S. attitudes toward free trade agreements have changed so much in recent years?
Yeah, that's really hard. No, so I'll start with the first. For most of the career that I was at USTR, we did have an agenda where we actively worked on negotiating free trade agreements. Other countries love free trade agreements with the United States because we're such an important market. And I want to say that when we negotiate, we're very careful how we negotiate on tariffs. We work very closely with the USDA Foreign Ag Service. I know we have something like 1,100 different tariff lines in agriculture that we have to negotiate on. We know the import-sensitive products. We know to protect them as much as possible while also pushing other countries to eliminate their tariffs. And the process, people think maybe we sit at the table with these foreign governments for hours and hours, and there's an element of that. But I like to describe that my time when negotiating a trade agreement is really divided in thirds. I spend 1/3 of my time negotiating with the industry, right? Because they all come, they all have their lists, and we have to sort through which ones we think are going to be doable, achievable, which ones will be really important, and we have to prioritize all those different lists from 100 different trade associations. 1/3 of my time is negotiating within the US government. So we run a very robust interagency process. Obviously, USDA is incredibly important and is a partner in that, but it's State Department, Justice, Commerce, Treasury, EPA, Food and Drug. I mean, it's all these agencies around the table when we put our positions together. And then the other element is Congress. We have to, well, we didn't have problems in agriculture with Congress, but in other sectors, you know, it was a negotiation with members of Congress. Generally, Congress let us off pretty easy because they knew we were fighting for exports. And then 1/3 of the time is with the foreign government. So it's a grueling process to negotiate these. Now, why has trade policy changed? And I think there's a lot of different factors that all have sort of merged into this change. One certainly is that China joined the WTO, and while there were a lot of high hopes in 2001 and 2002 on China changing its economy to be more market-based and fairer and not overproducing and dumping product on the export market, that's not what happened. And in fact, a lot of communities in the United States have been negatively impacted particularly in the manufacturing sectors, because of imports from China. And when people lose their jobs, obviously that changes their outlook and perspective on economic issues. So that's one element. We then had the recession in 2007, 2008 that further hurt our communities, again, in jobs. And so there's been this very slow trickle of concerns about the level of imports across the board coming into the United States. At the same time, we had the Tea Party come up on the right-hand side. So I got to use the right hand. The right-hand side, and at the same time, we had progressive liberals. And you know what happened over time? Those two, I'll call it the new right and the progressive liberals, they essentially have the same trade policy. And it's the folks in the middle that have been squished, the ones who have been pro-trade, the Blue Dog Coalition, one of the groups is called, really that have lost influence. And I think all of these different factors, and obviously President Trump winning in 2016, 2017, had a wholesale approach that was really supported by the American people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, America has spoken with the election results. So, Jonathan, I have a question for you. Everyone is waiting to see how this administration will use tariffs. Do you think it's a negotiating tool, or will it eventually lead to more retaliatory tariffs from some of our trading partners? And how do you suggest we prepare here at ABC?
Yeah, so I don't know, but I'm optimistic. And the reason I'm optimistic is because at least something is happening. It seems like for the past 4 years, and even during Trump's first administration, there was not a whole lot done on trade. It didn't seem like we had a lot of leverage to negotiate free trade agreements, while other countries were very successful, Australia in particular, in negotiating trade agreements with some of our key trade partners, China and India specifically. They struck a free trade agreement that was effective as of January 1st, 2019, where they have essentially a 0% import tariff or import duty in China. Mm-hmm. We went all the way up to 55% or back down to 25% for the time being.
Right.
And then in India, they enjoy basically 50% of whatever our tariff is for in-shell and for kernels, so they have a great advantage. And so from a tariff standpoint with key trade partners, I've seen nothing but other people winning and us losing. If we have to get sort of tough and difficult with a bit of this talk, I'm hopeful that that's successful in moving discussions forward so we can eventually resolve some of these issues. Now, outside of tariffs, and Sharon, you did a really good job of highlighting technical and regulatory barriers that we face as exporters. Those are probably the most acute on a daily basis. Obviously, tariffs affect market access and ultimately grower prices, so they're bad, they need to go away. But a lot of folks don't know how much we deal with that's not tariff related, but is trade related. So the discussions related to reciprocity and harmonization for all of the different things that we deal with, whether it's MRLs or labeling requirements or shipping requirements, you name it, those also need to be part of the discussion. So again, you highlighted it very well, Sharon. I think all of this trade talk is very broad. It includes a whole bunch of key stakeholders. And to your original question, Keith, I think it's probably going to take some pretty tough moves on our part to actually get things to break loose. I've been going to Washington, D.C. as part of an industry delegation now for the past 4 or 5 years. And it seems like every time we take your suggestion, Sharon, and come with real data and real information relative to the impact of trade on our industry, backed up by economic information, you name it, and real grower stories, bringing real growers to meet the folks making these decisions in D.C. For the past 4 years, it seems like that's all fallen on deaf ears. And even though there have been some areas where you can highlight some wins, the big wins have not come. During the first Trump administration, 2016 to 2020, I think we're all aligned around this short-term pain for long-term gain discussion. And whether or not we've got to endure a little bit of pain right now or not, things are different than they were back then, I'm not sure. But it seems like we're going to have to take some pretty big swings to make some progress here. And our lunch is being eaten by the Australians.
Right. Well, kind of related to that whole issue, the previous Trump administration had initiated some negotiations with the UK and Kenya. You mentioned that already, Sharon. But do you think that the new Trump administration might try to resume some of those discussions with UK and Kenya? What about updating the TRQs on almonds in the EU or even in Israel? We have a TRQ in Israel that has been a very complicated TRQ. And then the last thing is how can we keep agriculture in kind of a neutral space outside of some of these geopolitical disputes? Maybe that's several questions in one. But.
Wow. Okay. So I do think there's going to be an opportunity to do free trade agreement negotiations. It won't be right off the bat. It'll be, a year or two down the road. I'm not convinced the UK will want to come to the table, or if they do, they're going to want to exempt a lot of U.S. agriculture, which will not make a lot of our ag community happy because they are drooling to try and get into that UK market. Kenya, I could see happening. Again, I'm not convinced that's going to be a huge export market for us, but they may be willing to pick that up. TRQs in EU, I'm not optimistic that that'll be changed. Sorry. The EU right now is not saying the right things in the public in response to the incoming administration. They are sort of taking a fighting stance, unlike other countries like Mexico and Canada that are saying, let's work with you stance, right? Two very different. So I think that will remain to be seen. But the EU is so protectionist when it comes to ag, I see that hard. Israel is interesting. So when I said, when the new administration came in 2017, there was wanting ideas on what to do. So one of our ideas going in was, well, let's take this really bad agriculture deal with Israel that we had in 1986, and let's really make it a true free trade agreement negotiation and make it permanent. So there's some consistency going forward in our access into Israel. And we actually did have 3 rounds of I had support from on top. We had 3-4 rounds of negotiations. We were really close. And then the Israeli government fell apart. And they had one election, then they had another election, and we could not get it over the line. I know that staff at USTR are continuing to engage with Israel, but without the push from on top, I don't see that happening. Ag being neutral, that would be my ideal. I did a session for USDA last week, which was a sort of internal government thing, because there are a lot of staff, both at USDA, Commerce Department, State Department, who have not gone through what we went through in 2017 in the wholesale shift of our trade policy. So they asked me to talk to them about what we went through and how to get ready. But my concluding remark is, so State Department, you have a big role here. You may not think it, but can you please get those other countries not to hit agriculture when they retaliate? Let's do this in the name of food security.
Right.
I'm not optimistic that will happen, but maybe if enough of us talk about it, it would be great if we could keep ag out of the sights of the retaliation. They know ag is important to the president, the incoming president. So I think that's why it's going to be hard to get them to look at other areas.
Yeah, and when I was with FAS, I spent almost 12 years living and working in Greater China. And then when this whole thing, the trade war kind of broke out with China, I really felt like the Chinese made a big mistake by targeting U.S. agriculture. Because up to that point, I think a lot of states and congressmen, governors, they were fairly supportive of China, and they had been sending trade delegations there like crazy. And when China did that, they took a hard swing at U.S. agriculture. But maybe one of the positive things coming with China, and I was there with Clarice Turner last month. We went to China with a group of trade associations, and we were able to confirm that the current Minister of Agriculture, who was just appointed within the last 3 or 4 months, is Han Jun, and he was the chief negotiator when we were doing the agreement at USTR. So he has a very special understanding of U.S. agriculture. He's probably the most versed person in China on what our agricultural needs are here and how we might be able to work together with China in the future. So at least things with China, we shouldn't give up hope, and there's still a chance.
And I will say, really positive. I mean, President Trump at the time, he engaged with these foreign governments, right? He met with President Xi,
right,
North Korean as well. But so clearly he's ready to do the deal.
Right. And Jonathan, I wanted to get back to you, and you've already talked about some of those ABC visits to D.C. and this past year, or was it last year? You guys were in D.C., and I think Julie got a call from Ambassador Garcetti from India. You want to tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, it was actually Richard.
Richard got the call.
It was not this past year, but the year before, and he got a voicemail from somebody who claimed to be Ambassador Eric Garcetti, the U.S. ambassador to India. And he thought it was sort of a prank, but he called the guy back and he said, "Hey, can I meet you guys for breakfast the following morning?" So,
and you were in D.C.
We were in D.C., and it just so happened to be that Prime Minister Modi was in D.C. also for a state visit. And Ambassador Garcetti was able to share with us that almonds were a big part of the discussions related to trade during this visit, and that we were going to be getting some very big news that afternoon. And in fact, it was announced later on that day that the retaliatory tariffs in India on almonds were repealed, and we went back to 35 and 100 rupees per kg. So that was great news. It was good to see that positive movement. Right. In fact, it only meant that Australia's tariffs were further reduced because they're simply 50% of whatever ours is. So, yeah.
But it was a good sign that the Almond Board had been working directly with the USDA office out in India and been communicating with the U.S. Trade Representative's office in D.C. and we do these regular visits to Washington, and then out of the blue, Ambassador Garcetti makes that direct contact and shared the news.
And I think that speaks well to the engagement that the Almond Board and the industry in general has had in DC and in other places across the globe. Julie, Keith, the rest of the team are very well respected and held in high regard for the relationships that they have. And they also speak in three-letter acronyms. You guys have heard a lot of those discussed today. Which means that they speak the same language as the folks within USDA and every other agency, including USTR, negotiating on our behalf. And that goes a long ways. You know, when we do a board delegation to DC, we spend 4 or 5 days there, and every single day is chock full of people telling us just how much of a show pony the Almond Board is, or the almond industry in terms of their preparedness, the data that they have, the industry engagement, et cetera. And it's always well received, and what we always hear is that it's tremendously helpful. And I think that it goes a long ways in trying to keep us, I know you used the term on the table, but sometimes off the table, because agriculture is oftentimes a bargaining chip or a pawn used in a lot of these negotiations, because our foreign trade partners know that it hits home and hits very hard. And so to the extent that they can get us off the table, sometimes that's better than being on the table. So, you know, just from up here, I want to thank Almond Board staff, GTRA in particular, for all the time, effort, and energy that they put into working on this stuff. And as part of the TRAC committee, I get to see it all the time, but most of the industry does not.
Well, yeah. I think we have a very good team, and I remember talking with Richard Waycott as well in the past. And Richard was our former CEO, and we were talking about the almond industry having a single voice. And you know, our growers are right up in the Central Valley, it's about 400 miles long. You compare that to the American Soybean Association, where soybeans are grown in just about every state, and every state has its own little marketing agency. And you know, so there are all these different opinions, and it's much more difficult to go to Washington with a single voice. And even when I was working overseas with FAS, I could see it, you know, that the Almond Board was working together, and it was a really positive thing. So Sharon, I want to come back to you, and I think one of my big fears is that something's going to happen with the World Trade Organization, and that it's going to go away. And what would that mean? And within the World Trade Organization, you know, there are many, many different types of agreements and international trade rules that have been established and really were put there by the United States, you know, with U.S. leadership. But the two agreements that are most, I think, maybe are most important to what we do would be the SPS, the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, and the TBT, or Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. So are you concerned, without strong U.S. leadership, that the WTO could be eliminated in the next few years?
So no, I don't see the WTO being eliminated. One, it is, I think, very important for most countries around the world, and I would argue for U.S. agriculture, to not be eliminated. Yes, you know, it lowers the tariffs, as I said, it capped tariffs, but as Keith mentioned, the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures sets down rules. And while there are scofflaws to those rules, I'll argue the European Union on SPS, for example, or India on a range of things, and some would argue the US on some things, the vast majority of the countries actually are following these rules to have science-based, risk-based measures, to improve transparencies, to make sure you have evidence, to make things that are least trade distortive when you do actions, to make sure you're treating other WTO members the same in the same situation. So those are the ground rules for our trading system around the world. Very, very important. Where the WTO is having problems, one caused by the US and disrupting the dispute settlement system, I don't see that being fixed in the near term. They're also not doing a very good job of negotiating new trade agreements, in large part because of India, which tends to block everything. But let's not forget those underpinned ground rules, which are so important to so many countries.
Yeah. It reminded me of the slide that you showed of the 163 countries that the United States exports to, and India was over there on the far right, kind of a little blurb. Well, U.S. almond exports to India are the #1 agricultural export to India, which is really interesting, compared to most markets where it would be soybeans or corn or something like that. I have one last question for you, Jonathan, on USDA has provided a couple $2 billion in the past couple of years for us to go out and look at new markets. If something happens with China, if something would happen with India, we need to be prepared to look at new markets. We got funding, and we've already started some market assessments that are just now getting started in Morocco, Turkey, Brazil, and Indonesia. And Julie Adams just this morning hosted a panel on North Africa. So as we look at these export opportunities, do you have any thoughts on how we should prioritize new markets?
Yeah. So real quick, I'll just say that building some of these new markets, in my opinion, is really going to be the key to creating better and more sustainable economics for almond growers, right? Since we're 70% export, and the key is to make sure that growers have profitable years and continue to invest in their orchard and essentially stay in business. It means expanding the number of markets that we reach, the number of consumers that we touch, and ultimately getting more of our product into markets around the world. From our standpoint, on the trade side of the Almond Board, having the ability to work with global market development and to use the Project Thea, the study just completed by Deloitte, to look specifically not only at markets that have people that we can sell almonds to, but also market access has been really critical. So, for example, they've identified a number of markets that could be potential markets for the industry, but we either have poor trade relationships or there are a ton of technical barriers that exist, creating issues related to market access. And so it makes no sense to allocate marketing dollars to grow demand for almonds in a market you can't supply them to.
Yep.
And so I think trade is going to be a really important lens through which we have to view these new developing markets. I'd also say that we can't totally divorce our old markets in favor of all the new markets, because new markets take time not only to develop in terms of consumption and awareness of almonds, the health benefits and all those types of things, but the infrastructure needed to receive, process, distribute, market for retail, all those types of things takes a long, long time to build. So it's going to be really, really important to work in sort of both arenas, maintaining market access and growing consumption and demand in the existing markets, while also trying to carefully build access and build demand in some of these new markets. And I think Project Thea has done a tremendous job in highlighting both aspects of that, not only which new markets could potentially be great consumption hubs for almonds, but also highlighting some of the issues related to trade and market access that we'll have to go to work on right away. But that, in my opinion, is going to be paramount or critical to making sure that we have this demand being built ahead of supply and ultimately helping the grower here in California have a sustainable business.
Yeah, it's been amazing, looking at the trade statistics and the production in California. As our production has gone up, we maintain that 70% exports and 30% for domestic. So I guess somebody's doing something right. Almonds are a healthy product, so hopefully more people will consume more and more. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. Thank you, panelists, for a great presentation and discussion.